150 years ago, the Red River War altered the course of lives forever. Not only those who perished and those who survived, but every life since, even yours and mine. I am Andy Furnick, a filmmaker and local of the West Texas Panhandle, and I am with J. Brett Cruz to explore undertold stories of the Red River War. Born in the West Texas Panhandle, J. Brett Cruz is a legend of Red River War archaeology. He was awarded Master of Arts in Anthropology from Texas A&M University. Maestro Cruz is Director and Chief Archaeologist of Historic Sites Operations for the Texas Historical Commission, sponsor of the Red River War Battle Sites Project and investigation directed by Maestro Cruz beginning in 1998. He is the award-winning author of Battles of the Red River War, Archaeological Perspectives on the Indian Campaign of 1874. Maestro Cruz is most gracious and has consented to our live recording of his presentation today at Charles and Marianne Goodnight Ranch State Historic Site.
Thank you, Madeline. Good morning, everybody. It's good to see everyone here. Good to see a good turnout for this presentation. Glad to see some familiar faces in the audience that I hadn't seen in a while. It's good for me to be back in the Panhandle. I was born and raised here in the Panhandle, but I haven't lived here for the past 40 years or so it's not real often that I get to come back to the Panhandle, but I'm glad to be here this morning. Again, my name is Brett Cruz, and I'm the Chief Archaeologist with the Historic Sites Division at the Texas Historical Commission in Austin. Today, I want to speak to you about certain perspectives that I have on the Red River War of 1874 that was fought between the U.S. Army and the Southern Plains Indian tribes that took place largely here in the Texas Panhandle. I also want to talk a little about the Red River War Battle Sites Project that the Texas Historical Commission conducted to archaeologically document some of the major battle sites associated with the war. And I want to provide you with some of the insights on what we learned from those investigations. Now, I'm not going to talk about all of the battle sites, but I am going to talk about two of the battle sites in particular. Those two that I think will be of particular interest to the audience today, and those are the Battle of Red River and the Battle of Sweetwater Creek. The Red River War that occurred in 1874, it was just one of many such wars between the U.S. Army and Native Americans during the 19th century. And as you can see, it's a long list. And the Red River War was one of the last to take place. I think it's fair to say that outside of the immediate area of the Texas Panhandle, the Red River War is not particularly well known. It's often no more than a footnote in history books, and it's not likely that you read about it or studied it in school. I've often pondered why that's the case. After all, it involved the Comanche and the Kiowa and the Southern Cheyenne, all of whom were some of the most well-known and often deemed as the most dangerous and powerful of the Native American Plains tribes. So it's curious to me that the defeat and subjugation of those tribes hasn't been studied more or talked about more in the history books. I believe that one of the main reasons that the Red River War is not particularly well known is due to the fact that the U.S. Army did what it was ordered to do extremely effectively and efficiently. After all, within just 5 months from the time that the initial battle of the war took place on August 30th of 1874, the war was essentially over, and virtually every band of every tribe that was involved had surrendered and made their way to the reservations in Oklahoma. The lone holdout was Quanah Parker and his band of Comanches who had not engaged in any of the battles of the war. That's right, Quanah Parker and his band of Comanches had not engaged in any of the battles of the Red River War. As they were hiding out and evading the Army in the canyons of the South Plains east of Lubbock. But he did, of course, also eventually surrender in June of 1875. During the Red River War, there were no large-scale massacres like that would happen 2 years later with Colonel George Custer and the 7th Cavalry at the Battle of the Little Bighorn to grab the headlines of the nation's newspapers. When compared to similar 19th century campaigns, there were, in fact, relatively few deaths on either side during the Red River War, and the nation as a whole largely ignored the events of that summer. Nevertheless, the Red River War is significant not only to the history of Texas, but also to the history of the United States and certainly to the history of the indigenous tribes. So it was that 150 years ago, in the summer of 1874, the United States Army and the U.S. government dispatched some 3,000 soldiers to the southern plains of Texas for the express purpose of removing the Native American tribes who occupied the region and to force them onto reservations that had been established in western Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma. The Army's plan was relatively simple: locate the Indians, engage them wherever they were found, pursue them if they escaped, and destroy their supplies and livelihood. In essence, the plan was to break the Indians' will to fight until they surrendered and moved to the reservations. This campaign by the U.S. Army was known at the time as the Indian Campaign of 1874, but it's better known today as the Red River War. The Red River War consisted of several major battles and a few smaller skirmishes during the late summer and fall of 1874. Most of these engagements occurred in the eastern portion of the Texas Panhandle, along the headwaters of the Red River and its tributaries, thus the name Red River War. The Southern Plains tribes included the Kiowa, the Comanche, the Southern Cheyenne, and the Arapaho, who had moved onto the Southern Plains from the Northwest and Rocky Mountain regions beginning in the 1700s with their acquisition and adoption and use of horses. The Southern Plains tribes became nomadic hunters who relied heavily on the abundant buffalo herds for sustenance, and they followed the annual migrations of the herds. The buffalo was revered as a sacred and life-sustaining entity, and the Indians believed that if the buffalo were to someday disappear, they would likewise cease to exist. So why did the Red River War happen? First, let me say that I believe that the war was inevitable and it was unavoidable. I believe the only question was when it would happen, and the U.S. Army answered that question in the summer of 1874. I also believe that there were only two root causes of the war, and that those were the same reasons that were at the root of every war that occurred between the U.S. Army and virtually every Native American tribe that was encountered as America expanded across the continent and was settled by Anglo-Americans. And those root causes were racism by the whites against a culture that was radically different from their own, and greed for land and resources. Racism against Native Americans started early in the history of the United States, as is evident in the text of the Declaration of Independence itself, where Native Americans are referred to as merciless Indian savages. This racist view persisted throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, and unfortunately continues today in movies, music, and mascots, with Native Americans often depicted as comical or even dumb. Greed by the whites for land and the resources it afforded drove the racist sentiments as more settlers pushed farther and farther west across the continent. Racism towards Native Americans became part of the political rhetoric across the entire nation to justify the wars along the frontier and to take more and more land. All Indians were generally viewed as ungodly heathens who did not need or deserve the bounty that the land provided, and the whites believed it was their God-given right to take it. As more settlers moved west, it was inevitable that encounters with natives were going to happen, and as more and more settlers came and competition for land and resources became more intense, violence was often the unavoidable result. As more violence occurred, it became easier for the whites to claim that the Indians were merciless savages who, at the very least, needed to be reformed and Americanized, and if that was not possible, they should be eradicated. Wherever they were encountered and ultimately defeated, tribal members who had not been killed during the conflicts or who had not succumbed to diseases introduced by the white settlers were forced off of their lands and made to relocate, often hundreds of miles away from their homelands. And so it was the case with the Southern Plains tribes after their defeat in the Red River War. After the tribes walked into Fort Sill in Indian Territory and surrendered, the leaders of each tribe, or even just the ones that the army judged to be troublemakers, were separated from the rest of the tribe and were jailed. Subsequently, most of these were boarded onto trains and transported more than 1,200 miles away to Fort Marion, Florida, where they were imprisoned. It should be noted that none of the Red River War Indian prisoners received a trial or were ever convicted of any offense. They were simply imprisoned as prisoners of war. Even more horrendous, children from the tribes were separated from their parents and were sent more than 1,300 miles away to the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, where they were taught that their traditional cultural ways and religious beliefs were wrong. They were schooled on how to be white and how to become good American citizens. The Indian boys' hair was cut, their belongings were seized, and they were forced to wear what was deemed proper clothing. For many, if not most of the Indian children, they never saw their parents again. Short of the Holocaust, a more racist and cruel treatment of a people is hard for me to imagine. So greed for land and resources and racism as a justification for the greed were the root causes that drove the politics and the policies of the U.S. government and the U.S. Army during the 19th century Indian Wars. As for the specific issues that led to the Red River War, there were several factors, including Indian resentment over the loss of their lands, coupled with a longing to escape the restrictions imposed by reservation life, the demoralization among the Indian tribes due to the activities of white horse thieves and whiskey dealers, and last and perhaps most important, the activities of Anglo buffalo hunters who were rapidly depleting the single most important resource of the Southern Plains Indians, that of course being the buffalo. Between 1865 and 1875, the number of buffalo on the Great Plains fell from some 15 million to less than 1 million. Taken together, these factors formed a combination of such explosive potential that major trouble was inevitable. In June of 1874, after the Indians attacked the Adobe Walls buffalo hunters' compound that had been illegally established on the Canadian River here in the Panhandle, the U.S. Army decided that was sufficient reason to launch an all-out campaign against the Southern Plains tribes, and the result was the Red River War of 1874. I mentioned that I wanted to talk a little about the Red River War Battle Sites project that the Texas Historical Commission conducted beginning back in 1998 in anticipation of the 125th anniversary of the Red River War. 25 years ago. It's hard for me to believe it's been 25 years. Beginning that year and continuing over the next several years, me and a crew of persistent and hardy archaeologists documented several of the more significant battles of the Red River War. These included the Battle of Red River, which was the opening battle of the Red River War and is located here in Armstrong County and south into Briscoe County. The Battle of Lyman's Wagon Train in Hemphill County. The Buffalo Wallow Battle, also located in Hemphill County. The Battle of Sweetwater Creek in present Wheeler County. And the Battle of Round Timber Creek in Gray County. We, unfortunately, did not get access at the time to the Battle of McClellan Creek, and we only got partial access to a small portion of the Battle of Polladura Canyon. Though the Red River War battles were, as a group, part of the larger Plains Indian Wars, and as such, they have similar characteristics, each battle site is unique. Some of the battles were running engagements that covered long distances, with the Army and Indian combatants roughly equal in number. Examples of such engagements are the Battle of Red River and the Battle of Sweetwater Creek, in which the Army was in pursuit of retreating Indian villagers. Other battles, such as Lyman's Wagon Train and Buffalo Wallow, were stationary, with the Army forces being greatly outnumbered by Indian forces. At the Battle of Round Timber Creek, a small group of soldiers on a scouting expedition rode into what they believed was an abandoned Indian village where they were ambushed by a larger force of Cheyenne warriors. This engagement also turned into a long-running battle, but this time, the Indians were in pursuit of the retreating cavalry. Finally, at the Battle of Polladura Canyon, the Army surprised and attacked Cheyenne, Kiowa, and Comanche villagers who had taken refuge in the canyon, and the element of surprise worked significantly in the Army's favor. The available historical documents and military records relating to the Red River War provided some direction to our overall research orientation for the project. Historical documents, however, are often incomplete and often biased in their presentation of events. Archaeological investigation is based on the belief that behavioral relationships exist between historical events and the physical remains of those events. By identifying and analyzing the physical artifacts in their context, archaeologists can better understand cultural behaviors on the battle sites, and our research objectives were designed to examine those behaviors. Our first objective was to establish the chronology of the events that took place at each battle site. This entailed tracing the deployments of the Army and Indian combatants during each battle. To accomplish this objective, we recorded and mapped the exact location of each battle-related artifact that was discovered in order to trace combatant movements and to assess battle developments. By analyzing the artifact types and their patterns across the battle sites and comparing those patterns with the historical documents, we could establish the chronology of battle events and their locations on the battle sites. We also wanted to evaluate the Army and Indian military tactics used at each battle site and to see how those tactics were expressed and preserved in the archaeological record. For example, the U.S. Army had precise deployment tactics for infantry and cavalry units, which had their roots in European warfare and were refined during the Civil War. But now, the Army was facing a military foe whose tactics were unlike any it had previously encountered, those of the comparatively unstructured and individually based Plains Indians. Likewise, the Indians were facing a foe that was superior in weapons, supplies, and manpower. How did the Indians respond militarily to the sudden onslaught in their homeland and against their villages? Did they rely on their traditional military tactics, or did they adopt new tactics to meet this challenge? One of the most important battle site objectives was to determine the types of armaments used. The weapons the troopers were using in 1874 are well documented in the Army records and military ordnance returns, but much less was known about the types and numbers of firearms that the Indians used. During the project, firearm types were identified by using modern firearms identification analysis. These procedures were used to determine ammunition calibers and to examine distinguishing marks on bullets and cartridge cases. By comparing the rifle firing pin and extractor marks on the recovered cartridge cases from each site, we could ascertain a minimum number of firearms per weapon type for each of the battle sites. Those cartridges not associated with the Army, according to the official Army records and ordnance returns, could be assumed to be from Indian firearms. Another objective of our investigations was to ascertain the accuracy and degree of bias of the Army records that pertain to the Red River War battle sites. Many of the records make reference to specific types of weapons being used by the Indians, along with statements about how well armed the Indians were. In addition, the records often provide specific statements about the number of Indians involved. We wanted to see if these statements were supported by the archaeological evidence. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to talk about two of the battle sites, and then I'll show you some examples of some of the artifacts that we recovered from our investigations. One of the battle sites that we looked at was the Battle of Red River, which was fought on August 30th, 1874, and was the opening battle of the war. At this battle, Colonel Nelson A. Miles led 8 companies of the 6th Cavalry, 4 companies of the 5th Infantry, and an artillery detachment that included one 10-pounder Parrott rifle, which is actually a small cannon that fired a 10-pound shell and hence the name, and 2 10-barreled 50-caliber Gatling guns. By the way, this was the first battle west of the Mississippi River where the Gatling gun was used in combat. Altogether, Miles's command totaled about 750 men. Miles and his troops had been following a large Indian trail southwest for several days across the Panhandle, and they finally caught up with the Indians as they were approaching the Prairie Dog Town fork of the Red River. Miles stated that the Indians had taken positions in the high bluffs in an irregular line extending 5 to 7 miles, and their numbers he estimated at from 400 to 600 warriors. The Indian forces were led by Cheyenne Chief Ironshirt. The Indian warriors had initially taken positions on a line of low hills known today as the Griffin Hills, which are about 12 miles northeast of the Red River. When the battle started, Miles states in his report that he deployed his troops with the 1st Battalion of Cavalry under Major Charles Compton on the right, the 2nd Battalion under Major James Biddle was placed to the left, and the artillery under the command of Lieutenant James Pope was placed in the center. Miles ordered a general advance and the Indian warriors began to retreat, but they took various positions among the hills and canyons north of the Red River as they were attempting to slow the advance of the soldiers to allow more time for their families to escape. For the next 5 hours, and over a distance of about 12 miles, the Indians fought a strong rearguard action among the high bluffs and deep ravines. While the Indian warriors were engaging the U.S. Army, the Indian families successfully escaped across the Prairie Dog Town Fork of the Red River, up Tooele Canyon, and out onto the high plains of the Llano Estacado. According to his official report, Miles stated that no soldiers were killed during the battle, but he estimated as many as 25 warriors were killed, though that number was never confirmed. We began our investigations of the battle site by conducting a metal detector survey across the area. Now let me be clear. When I say that we metal detected the battle site, I in no way want you to think that we covered 100% of the battle. Based on the distribution of the artifacts that we did find, this battle site covers an area of more than 12 miles long and at least 2.5 miles wide, or roughly 22,238 acres. Or put another way, roughly 35 square miles. And it was over some of the roughest terrain in Texas. But we did cover enough of it to be able to discern the battle movements. By precisely locating and mapping each battle-related metal artifact and comparing the distribution of the artifacts with the historical documents and Army reports, we were able to identify the Army deployment lines and how the Army troops advanced across the battle, as well as identify where the Indians took positions during the battle. We were also able to identify where the Army artillery was set up during the battle, marked Cannon Hill on this image, and where artillery shells were fired and impacted towards specific Indian locations. At one point in the battle, Captain Chaffee and I Company made a charge up a steep hill to clear a group of Indians from it. Colonel Miles wrote about the charge stating, quote, "Captain Chaffee gallantly led his company in a charge up a steep hill using only their pistols. We were able to find and document the location of this charge, which is marked with numerous .45 caliber Colt pistol cartridges and bullets, as well as .44 caliber rifle cartridge cases that were being used by the Indians. Based on the mapped location of each of the artifacts that we found, we were able to document the direction the cavalry charge came from, marked by the .45 Colt cartridge cases, as well as the direction the Indians retreated off the hill, marked by the .45 caliber Colt bullets." Another charge during the battle was made by Major Charles Compton, who was commanding the right column. Of this charge, Colonel Miles states in his report, quote, "The Indians had taken position on the right, occupying a high crest in strong force. A few artillery shell were fired at this body, and a splendid cavalry charge was made by the 1st Battalion, 6th Cavalry, under Major Compton, up a steep crest of 200 feet, and the position was carried in fine order." Again, we were able to locate this hill and document the cavalry charge, and in addition to the Army cartridges, the archaeological investigations also recovered fragments of 2 exploded Hotchkiss artillery shells near the north base of the hill, just as Miles had stated. After taking this hill, the right column of Army troops continued to the Red River and then moved south into Tooele Canyon, where they discovered that the villagers had escaped out of the canyon. From the Battle of Red River site, we recovered more than 1,200 battle-related artifacts, most of which, of course, were cartridges and bullets. On the basis of firing pin signatures on the recovered cartridge cases, a minimum of 71 individual weapons were represented from our sample of artifacts. Yes, that's a low number of weapons given the number of combatants, but many of the cartridge cases that we recovered were just too oxidized and corroded to analyze the firing pin signatures. And remember, this was just a small sample of the actual number of cartridges on the battlefield that we recovered. Of the individual weapons identified, 52 are associated with the U.S. Army and 19 with the Indian combatants. That works out to be a ratio of about 2.7 Army firearms to every Indian firearm. Our analysis suggests that only about 30 to 35% of the Indians had firearms of any kind, and many of those firearms were old muzzle loaders based on the fact that we recovered a number of rifle balls that were from muzzle loaders. Also, it is likely that there was probably not as many Indian warriors at the battle site as Colonel Miles stated. Another of the battle sites that we investigated was the Battle of Sweetwater Creek, which took place on September the 12th of 1874 between Sweetwater Creek and the Ouachita River in present-day Wheeler County. At this battle, Major William Price was leading 110 men of the 8th Cavalry with 1 howitzer northeast when they encountered a large force of Kiowa and Comanche warriors who were under the leadership of Kiowa Chief Lone Wolf. The Indians had taken position on a high ridge north of the soldiers. Major Price was not aware of it at the time, but the apparent reason the Indians had taken their positions on the ridge in apparent readiness to engage a mounted force of cavalry, which was highly irregular for Plains Indians, was that their families were nearby and were desperately trying to elude the soldiers. Like at the Battle of Red River that we just talked about, the warriors wanted to delay the mounted troopers long enough to allow the villagers time to escape to the west behind the ridge. Price soon ordered the troopers to charge the ridge and to sweep the Indians to the left. According to Price, when the firing started, the Indians began circling charges and breaking up into smaller groups to attack his flanks. One of the groups of warriors were apparently intent on taking the howitzer that Price had with him. Price received word during the battle that the Indians were concentrating on the gun, getting into the ravines, and were closing in on the artillery piece. So Price took a platoon to protect the gun, and he successfully drove the warriors back. The entire battle lasted for about 3 hours until the soldiers mounted a final desperate charge and repelled the Indians. Price states that there were 150 to 175 Indian warriors at the battle, and according to him, they were all armed with long-range guns, most of them breech loaders, he said. Price reported that the soldiers were able to clear the Indians from every position they occupied and that they drove them for 6 or 7 miles when the warriors fled in every direction and the cavalry troops abandoned the chase. For the Indian warriors, they succeeded in their objective of decoying the soldiers away from the retreating Indian women and children. Price did not become aware that the Indian villagers were even there until several hours after the battle, and when he did discover it, he did not pursue the Indians. None of the 8th Cavalry soldiers were hurt in the battle, and Price reported that 8 Indians were killed or badly wounded. 2 days after the battle, Lieutenant Farnsworth was scouting the area west of the scene of the battle when he crossed the trail left by the fleeing Indian villagers, which he reported was headed in a southwest direction and that the trail was more than a mile wide. He estimated there were more than 1,000 head of stock with the Indians. Any guesses where this group of Indians were headed and where this more than 1,000 head of stock wound up? Palo Canyon. Within about 2 weeks, all of these animals would be killed. As for our investigations at the Battle of Sweetwater Creek, the precise location of the battle was not known prior to our fieldwork. So the first thing that we had to do was to locate the battle site. Major Price had stated in his report that his column of cavalry was between Sweetwater Creek and the Washita River when they encountered the Indians who had taken positions on a high ridge to the north. We were fortunate enough to find and examine an 1875 Army campaign map of the area, and we noticed that it had a pair of crossed sabers on it situated between Sweetwater Creek and the dry fork of the Washita River. Crossed sabers was the symbol typically used on maps of the time to mark a battle or engagement. The crossed saber symbol on the map was not labeled, but the location seemed right for Major Price's engagement with the Indians. So using the map, we determined as precisely as possible the latitude and longitude indicated by the cross sabers, and we entered that information into our GPS receiver. And we had the GPS then lead us to that precise location, which turned out to be on top of a high ridge approximately 3 miles north of Sweetwater Creek. As luck would have it, within just a few minutes, we were finding and marking battle-related artifacts, notably 50 caliber Sharps cartridge cases. The Sharps 50 caliber was the rifle being used exclusively by the 8th Cavalry in 1874, so we were confident that we had in fact located the battle site. The distribution of battle-related artifacts that we mapped across the site seems to match the description of the battle fairly closely as related by Major Price in his report. It appears the Indians had in fact taken positions on the higher elevations of the ridge and had broken out into smaller groups, firing a few shots at the soldiers along the ridge before fleeing to the next position. The Indian and Army cartridges were for the most part recovered in small groups of only a few rounds, with these groups widely dispersed along the ridge for a distance of about 7 miles, precisely as Major Price had reported. Now, one interesting aspect of this battle was whether the mountain howitzer that Price had with him was actually used or not during the battle. From the description of the battle given by Price, it appears that the most intense fighting occurred around the howitzer. His statement that the Indians were dismounting from their horses, getting into the nearby ravines, and firing at short range suggests that initially the battle was somewhat stationary, with the Indians apparently intent on taking the cannon. In his official report, Major Price does not specifically state that the howitzer was used during the engagement. In fact, he states that the rounds of howitzer shot, notice I said shot, had become wet by the heavy rains from the night before and were useless. This statement has led some researchers to reasonably conclude that the howitzer was not used during the battle. For example, author and historian James Haley, in his excellent book, The Buffalo War, states that the howitzer was useless to Price, and he writes, quote, "If the howitzer had been serviceable, it would have made things go very badly for the Indians, and it was just their good fortune that it had become a liability to Price." But the archaeological investigations at the battle site told a different story. On a small hill about a mile south of the high ridge where the Indians had taken their initial positions, we found 141 spent .50 caliber Sharps cartridges. The cartridges were spread across the hilltop in a north-south orientation, and near the center of the cartridge cluster, we found a priming wire and a friction primer for our mountain howitzer. A friction primer is a small copper tube that was filled with powder and was the principal means of igniting the powder charge in the cannon. And the priming wire was used for piercing the bag that contained the powder charge prior to inserting the friction primer in the vent of the cannon. Now, the friction primer and the wire could have just been lost during the battle without the howitzer actually having been fired. But the archaeological investigations established that the howitzer was indeed used during the battle, as evidenced by the recovery of fragments of 2 exploded howitzer canisters and numerous lead shot from the canisters. Notice that I said howitzer canisters, and I'll explain that in a second. The canister fragments and lead shot were found in a small ravine about 325 yards northwest of the friction primer and priming wire, and confirms that the howitzer was indeed used during the engagement. So just to explain, the mountain howitzer was capable of firing both a spherical or round shot, like a cannonball, as well as a canister that was shaped like a tin can. Price had both types with him, and he stated in his report that the shot pieces had become wet and were not usable, but he doesn't mention anything about the canister shells, which apparently had not gotten wet and were in fact used during the battle. So it appears that once the Indians were not able to take the howitzer, they apparently began to retreat to the north and west. The distribution of the battle-related artifacts across the site suggests that the engagement now became a running battle. It appears that once the Indian warriors reached the high plains above the breaks of the Sweetwater Creek drainage, they broke off the engagement since no artifacts were found above the breaks. Altogether, we recovered 578 battle-related artifacts during our investigations. Of these, 405 are associated with the Army and 173 with the Indians. Okay, so let's take a quick look at some of the artifacts that we recovered from the battle sites during our investigations. The most common type of artifact recovered was munitions-related items, with cartridge cases being the most common. The 3 in the middle, the .45 Colt cartridge, .45 55 or .45 70, and the .50 70, those are all military cartridges. The 2 on the end, A here, .44 Henry, and the .56 50 Spinter, those are Native American. Bullets. A lot of different types of bullets were found. I mentioned earlier rifle balls. This is a .61 caliber copper rifle ball. We found a number of lead rifle balls as well from a number of the battle sites. Bullets of various calibers. In particular, of interest are the .50 caliber bullets that we recovered from the Battle of Red River site that were fired from a Gatling gun. Here's an interesting cluster of artifacts that we found at the Battle of Sweetwater Creek. These are 56 unfired Spencer cartridges. They were probably in a leather bag that was dropped during the battle by one of the Indian warriors. On the right there's a couple of .45 55 or .45 70 cartridges. The round on the bottom has been struck by a bullet. Exploded Hotchkiss shell fragments here on the right. We recovered 145 pieces representing 9 different artillery shells. These are all from the Battle of Red River site. On the left here is just an example of an unexploded shell, which we did not find. This is just to show you what one looked like. The 12-pounder howitzer canister that I just mentioned from the Battle of Sweetwater Creek site, this is one of them that we recovered. And the .69 caliber lead shot up here, those were packed inside the canister, and then when it exploded, it acted sort of like a shotgun blast. Just the bullets went everywhere. Other items associated with the Army, a cavalry curry comb and a spur. These are both from the Battle of Red River site. Metal arrow points. We found metal arrow points at every battle site that we worked, often in large numbers. This tells me that the Indians were relying heavily on the bow and arrow and were not as well armed. That's what the Army said that they were as far as the firearms. When you're using bows and arrows, which has a very short range, against military weapons that had a range up to 1,000 yards, that's not a well-armed enemy, in my opinion. couple of interesting other artifacts that we recovered. On the left is a Sheffield Bowie knife with a bone handle, and then a butcher knife with an interesting, I don't know if you'd make it out in this light or not, but on the guard here, it's incised with a number of different lines and stuff, perhaps denoting ownership. We don't know, but it's interesting. These are both from an Indian village site that we looked at the Battle of Round Timber Creek. Other types of artifacts that we found that were associated with the Indian villagers that were lost as they were fleeing ahead of the army. Just various types of tools and jewelry representing probably items that were just discarded as they were quickly fleeing or lost as they were fleeing. This is an interesting cluster. All of these, they're little rolled tin or metal cone-shaped tinklers is what we call them. And all of these were found together in one cluster. This bag that's on the right there, that's just an example of showing probably how they were used. This bag is in the collection at the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum, showing how these tinklers were used to decorate. Okay, so based on the results of our investigations and the analysis of the artifacts from all of the battle sites that we looked at, we concluded that there were not as many Indian combatants as the Army officers stated in their official reports. The numbers just don't add up. From what was estimated in the field, in the number of combatants and families that were reported that they were chasing versus how many Indians eventually surrendered at Fort Sill, the numbers just don't add up. The Indians were not as well armed as the Army report suggests they were. As we saw, bows and arrows were being heavily used by the Indians. From our analysis, it appears that only about 30 to 35% of the Indian combatants had firearms of any kind, and those were often older model rifles and even musket loaders. And finally, it appears that the Indians were curating what ammunition they did have. Much of the ammunition they were using had not been manufactured for almost 10 years. So for the most part, they were using their ammunition quite sparingly and cautiously. I go into a lot more detail about all of the battle sites that we investigated in my book, as well as descriptions of all the artifacts and the things that we've learned and concluded during our investigations of the Red River War. So if you're interested, the book is still available. It's in its second printing now from Texas A&M University Press, or you can get it from Amazon, or you can buy a copy today here at Goodnight Ranch, and I'd be happy to sign it if you want me to. Anyway, that's my presentation, and I'd be happy to take any questions if anyone has any.
Whatever you do, please join us next episode for the following live question and answer segment with J. Brett Cruz. This program is brought to you by Wheeler County Historical Commission and the Frontier Regiment of the High Plains.